The storm had rolled in fast that night over the small town of Millbrook, draping everything in darkness and relentless rain. Officer Maria Reyes was just minutes away from clocking out, sipping lukewarm coffee at her desk, when a low, guttural scratching sound came from the front entrance of the station. She paused, the sound unusual at that hour, especially with the weather outside howling like a warning. Curiosity turned to alarm as the station door suddenly creaked open, wind lashing rain inside. Standing in the doorway was a large, soaking, wet German shepherd, his coat matted with mud and blood, his eyes locked onto hers with fierce urgency. Reyes dropped her cup. The dog wore a torn K9 vest, faded but still readable. It bore the name Coda. He limped forward slowly, one paw leaving a trail of crimson on the tiled floor. But it wasn't the dog alone that made Reyes leap from her chair. Behind him, clutching weakly to his flank, was a young girl. No more than 10, her thin arms were scraped, her clothes ragged and soaked through. She looked pale, frightened, and barely conscious, every step a struggle. Coda nudged her gently with his head, encouraging her to move forward, his body sheltering hers from the storm still raging behind them. Reyes ran toward them, kneeling to support the girl before she collapsed. "Hey, sweetheart, you're safe now," she whispered, wrapping her coat around the shivering child. She looked down at the dog, who now lay panting at her feet, his chest rising heavily. He didn't bark or whimper. He didn't need to. His mission was complete. Backup officers rushed in, stunned at the sight. Reyes couldn't stop staring at the dog's tag. The name, the number, the unit. She remembered. Coda had been declared missing in action 3 years ago, presumed dead after a warehouse explosion during a drug bust. But here he was, older, grayer, and scarred, and somehow still saving lives. The girl tried to speak, her lips trembling, and finally whispered, "He found me." Before her eyes fluttered shut, Reyes cradled her gently, heart-pounding, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. Outside, thunder cracked through the night sky, but inside that quiet station, something sacred had just entered, a miracle wrapped in fur and courage. The rain hadn't stopped, and the scent of wet earth and adrenaline still lingered in the air. Officer Reyes sat beside the hospital bed, watching the little girl sleep beneath clean white sheets. Her name, they had learned, was Emily. No missing person report had been filed yet, just another child lost in the cracks of a failing system. But it wasn't Emily's condition that consumed Reyes' thoughts. It was the dog, Coda. 3 years ago, Coda had been a legend in their department, a fearless K9 trained for search and rescue, narcotics detection, and protection. He had served beside Officer Mark Cullen, a kind soul and a seasoned handler, but on a rainy night not unlike this one, a warehouse raid had gone terribly wrong. An explosion rocked the building. Cullen survived barely. Coda never came out. They searched for days, but no body was found. Eventually, the department held a ceremony and retired his name with honor. No one ever expected to see him again, until now. Reyes walked down to the hospital parking lot, where Coda was resting in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in warm towels. The vet was on her way, but time was fragile. The dog's eyes fluttered open as she approached. He looked tired, no drained, but alert. She crouched beside him, running a hand over his damp fur. He didn't flinch. "You knew where to go," she murmured, voice catching. "You came home." Inside the hospital, Emily had briefly regained consciousness. A nurse called Reyes back in as the girl whispered in hoarse fragments. He came into the woods, broke the door. He stayed when I was scared." The words were soft, but they cut through the noise like a siren. She didn't know his name, only that he'd come in the middle of the night, fought off someone terrifying, and brought her here. "How did he find you?" Reyes asked, kneeling beside her. "I don't know," Emily said weakly. "But he waited with me, like he was meant to. There were no clear answers, no GPS collar, no recent sightings, just an old K9, presumed dead, who had crossed miles of wilderness to rescue a child no one was looking for. The impossible had happened, and somehow it felt exactly right. Emily's voice was quiet, like wind through broken leaves. as she lay propped up on pillows, eyes heavy with sleep and trauma. Doctors said she was dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in minor injuries, but alive. That alone felt like a miracle. Officer Reyes sat nearby, notebook in hand, though she hardly wrote a word. Her eyes stayed on the child's face, listening closely as the girl tried to piece together how it all happened. She remembered being taken from her foster home in the middle of the night. A man she barely knew, someone from her past placements, had whispered her name through the window and told her to come with him. She hadn't known who to trust. She had followed. Days blurred after that. The cabin was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and silence. No phone, no roads. She cried quietly every night, too afraid to scream, too tired to run. Then came the sound of something scratching at the door. At first, Emily said, "I thought it was a wolf." Her voice trembled, but it was him. He looked at me like he knew me. Her fingers clutched the blanket. He didn't bark or growl. He just stared, like he was waiting for me to move. She described how Coda had clawed at the shed door until the wood splintered. The man had tried to stop him, but the dog lunged, biting his leg and forcing him back. Coda's body bore the evidence, deep cuts, bruises, even a cracked rib, but he hadn't backed down. Emily ran. Coda followed, limping, nudging her when she slowed, licking her hand when she cried. She said he stayed just close enough to be her shadow, leading her as if he knew exactly where he was going. They traveled all night, through mud, thorns, and rain. The cold bit at her skin, but she followed him like he was the only thing that made sense. "He wouldn't let me stop," she whispered, "not even when I wanted to give up. It's like he knew. He had to get me somewhere. And he brought her to the police station, the only home he had ever known. He'd vanished 3 years ago, and now, against all odds, he had returned, not to be found, but to find someone else. The sun shone brightly on the town square that Saturday morning, a welcome change from the stormy days before. Families gathered on the grass, children with painted faces and flags in their hands, unaware of how close their town had come to another forgotten tragedy. A small stage had been set up near the courthouse, flanked by a large American flag and a banner that read "Heroes Walk Among Us." Officer Reyes stood at the podium, her voice firm but emotional as she addressed the crowd. 3 years ago, she began, "We said goodbye to one of our own, a partner, a protector, and a friend. We thought his story had ended, but last week he returned, not to be remembered, but to remind us who he is." Coda stood at center stage beside Emily, now dressed in a clean blue dress, her blonde hair tied in soft braids. She looked healthier, her cheeks less sunken, her eyes no longer wide with fear. She knelt beside the old dog and kissed his head gently, a silent thank you that needed no words. Chief Daniels stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. "For bravery beyond measure," he said, "for loyalty that defies logic, and for a heart that never stopped serving, we award K-9 Officer Coda the Medal of Valor." He fastened the medal around the dog's neck. It glinted in the morning sun, catching the eyes of everyone in the crowd. Coda didn't react the way a person might. He didn't puff out his chest or wag his tail. He simply sat tall, eyes scanning the people before him, as if making sure they were all safe. His gray muzzle twitched slightly as Emily leaned into him again. Reyes stepped back to the microphone. "He didn't have to come back," she said, her voice cracking. "But he did, because some bonds, some duties, are stronger than time, fear, or even death. Coda didn't just rescue a child. He reminded us what courage looks like." The crowd stood and applauded. Some people wiped away tears. Others placed hands on hearts. Emily looked up at the officers behind her, then back at Coda, and whispered something only he could hear. And in that moment, as sunlight bathed the square and a town remembered what true heroism meant, the old dog seemed to smile, not with his mouth, But with his eyes, time moved forward, as it always does, though some moments never truly fade. Koda spent his final days in the warmth of a real home, Mimily's new home. She had been adopted by a kind couple from the town, people who had followed her story and couldn't bear the idea of her entering the foster system again. Their quiet farmhouse stood at the edge of the woods, the same kind of place that once terrified her. Now it was filled with light, laughter, and the sound of paws tapping gently against wooden floors. Koda had a soft bed in her room, though more often than not, he chose to sleep underneath hers. Emily would reach her hand down each night, just to feel his fur and know he was there. He was slower now, each breath a little heavier, each step more careful. The vet had warned them his injuries had taken a toll, and time itself had done the rest. But he stayed. He stayed until he knew she was safe, not just physically, but in her heart. One morning, Emily didn't hear his usual soft snore. She climbed out of bed and knelt beside him. His eyes were closed, his body still, her hand resting gently on his chest where no rise or fall met her touch. Tears came slowly, then all at once, as she curled beside him and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." They buried Koda beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, wrapping him in the flag he had once been honored beneath. Emily placed his tag, worn and scratched, round her neck before walking away. She never took it off again. Years passed. Emily grew strong. She graduated high school with honors, then joined a search and rescue training program. She worked with trauma victims, with missing children, with families who had lost hope. And in every face she comforted, she saw a glimpse of her younger self, alone, scared, waiting in the dark. When people asked her why she chose that path, she would simply smile and say, "Because once, someone found me when no one else even knew I was missing." And though the world moved on, though the headlines faded and people forgot the name, Koda lived on, in every child she rescued, in every life she touched. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They wear fur, walk quietly, and change the world with a single act of loyalty.